In the year 1343, a little girl was born in the city of Norwich in the east of England. Almost nothing is known about her early life, not her family or her father's occupation or even her birth name. We do know that in early 1349, when this little girl was 5 or 6, everything changed for her. The terrible new disease that had swept Europe arrived in Norwich. So many people died that bodies were piled on carts and buried in mass graves, in graveyards hastily enlarged to make more space. Of every 5 people this little girl knew, probably 2 of them were gone. We know today that plague is a bacterial disease spread by fleas on rats, but in the 14th century, no one knew what caused it. Poisons in the air, maybe, or perhaps immoral behavior, maybe bathing too much. The plague burned itself out after a year or so, and life in Norwich began to resume, but nothing like it had been before. Everyone was aware all the time how precarious life was. You could be fine and healthy and then dead a few days later, and everyone who knew you could be dead too. Grave markers and memorial tablets began to plead, "Remember me. In case no one else is left, remember me." There were far fewer people around. The farm workers who had survived began demanding higher wages, which frightened and angered landowners. The economic structures from before the plague were breaking down, and it wasn't clear what would replace them. Plague is bacterial, so there is no immunity to it, and only 12 years later, in 1361, it came roaring back. Our little girl was now grown up, and the new normal that she'd come to expect was thrown into chaos again. More deaths, more disruption, more fear. When this young woman was 30 in 1373, she became gravely ill herself. It did not look good for her, and her mother called a priest to give her last rites. As the priest prayed over her holding a crucifix, this woman saw the crucified body of Jesus begin to bleed. That night she had 15 visions of Jesus, and one more the next night. She called them showings, these visions of God's unshakable, overwhelming love for us in Jesus Christ. When she recovered, she or someone else wrote them down, and she decided to spend the rest of her life praying, meditating, and teaching about what she had seen. She moved into a cell at the Church of St. Julian in Norwich, and that's what people began calling her, Julian. The plague recurred about every 10 years. It gradually became an expected fact of life. No one could stop it, so people learned to live with it. The chronic shortage of labor led to frequent conflict between landowners and peasants, and then armed revolt, and eventually restructuring of England's economy. Julian witnessed all this, absorbed it, reflected on it, and continued writing about God's goodness and love. When she was in her 50s, she wrote, "If there is anywhere on earth a lover of God who is always kept safe, I know nothing of it, for it was not shown to me. But this was shown, that in falling and rising again, we are always kept in that same precious love." I trained as a historian before I became a priest, and maybe this is my own bias, but our history as Christians is both a comfort and a liberation for us. Whatever we are facing, pandemics, massive economic disruption, new technologies that radically change society, wars, famines, revolutions, earthquakes, hurricanes, God's people have been here before. When we listen to the voices of our ancestors in faith, when they tell us how God was present and active for them, we see how God is present and active for us today. And our history sets us free from believing that the way things are right now is the way they have to be. Christians of the past prayed and worshiped and made community in all kinds of different ways. Reaching into our past and seeing its rich diversity helps us to imagine the future, especially when circumstances force us to change what we're used to. I cannot think of a better guide for us Christians in 2020 than Julian of Norwich. Some of you at St. John's read her book, Revelations of Divine Love, last year. And I suspect we'll go back to her again and again. Julian's absolute confidence in God's goodness and love is not some kind of Pollyannish, naive optimism. She lived through dreadful events, a pandemic even worse than COVID-19, the violent reordering of society and the economy, and it convinced her even more of God's abiding love and constant presence with us. She knew it because she lived it. God is love, and God is alongside us. Julian understood this through experience, and she could have learned it from the Gospel according to John. On the night before Passover, Jesus has gathered his disciples for one last dinner together. He has washed their feet for them, taking the part of a slave. He has called them his little children, and he has just told them that he'll be leaving soon. The disciples are confused, scared, grieving. Jesus has been their advocate. The word in Greek means literally one who is called to be alongside. In the person of Jesus, God's self, has come alongside the disciples to share their life, to be the light of the world, the bread of life, the door, the way, the truth, and the life for them. God has done this out of love for the world, that in seeing and knowing Jesus, the world might see and know God. The disciples know Jesus. They abide in him. They are in relationship with him. Jesus has been the advocate, and now that he is leaving, he's sending another advocate to be alongside the disciples. Jesus will not leave his little children orphaned. Another advocate, the Holy Spirit, will accompany the disciples from here, sharing their life as Jesus has done until now. The disciples will know the Spirit and abide in the Spirit the same way they know and abide in Jesus. And the Spirit will guide the disciples into even deeper relationship with God, in whom we live and move and have our being. Jesus is the truth. He still has many things to teach the disciples, but they aren't ready to hear it yet. When they are, the Spirit will lead the disciples into all the truth. The fullness of relationship with God will open for the disciples after Jesus is gone because of the work of the Holy Spirit, the one who is called to be alongside. In the disciples' falling and rising, they are always kept in that same precious love. The disciples, like Julian of Norwich, like us, are facing perilous, uncertain times. We need an advocate alongside us. Caroline Lewis observes, Jesus knows that what lies ahead we cannot do on our own, that what we will be called to face we cannot do without his help, that in our temptation to do all the things, reminders will be necessary that it's not our job to do everything. And so Jesus sends the Holy Spirit to accompany us. We're not waiting until Pentecost, the great feast of the Holy Spirit in 2 weeks, because we need the Spirit alongside us now. And the Spirit is here, abiding with us, guiding us deeper into a relationship with God in Jesus Christ. As Julian was shown, there is no guarantee that lovers of God will always be kept safe. The times are perilous for everyone. Even in so-called safe times, Jesus needs us to carry his love into the unsafe places, to seek and serve him in all persons, to shine his light into the dark corners of our own hearts. Yet wherever we go, whatever happens to us, we are always kept in that precious love, and we don't have to be afraid of anything. So I invite you to reflect on your own life for a moment. How have you been? How are you being held in the precious love of God? Where has the advocate, the Holy Spirit, come alongside you?